Welcome to the Scientific Worldview, the podcast dedicated to exploring the big questions in science and philosophy. I am Daniel Gambacorta.
I'm Atana Shannon.
Atana. Why do we have emotion? Why do we feel?
Brain chemicals, electricity.
That's definitely part of the proximate explanation. Your brain is doing something.
It's doing something.
We can also think about the ultimate explanation. Why do those emotions exist in the first place? Why do you even have this kind of brain to begin with that has those feelings?
Man, it's just meat with electricity in it. It's confusing.
But why this particular meat? That's what I'm getting at. It could have been some other configuration of meat.
How existential of you.
Well, here we are thinking about evolutionary psychology. Why would we evolve this sort of brain that produced these kinds of feelings?
Probably from an evolutionary standpoint, in the name of fitness and survival.
Our emotions must come down to somehow enhancing survival and reproduction.
Somehow.
Somehow, some way. And I say, let's get into it. In previous episodes, we talked about evolutionary psychology. We went over the basics, but we didn't really dive headfirst into evolutionary psychological research. So just one sentence review of what evolutionary psychology is. We're trying to understand the function of psychological mechanisms in terms of how they promote survival and reproduction.
Because that's how they got there, right?
Must be how they got there. It wasn't magic. We have talked before about research showing that there's these basic facial expressions, and we find these basic facial expressions around the world.
And they're universal across. Everybody can recognize happy, sad, disgust, anger. There's more. I always thought that was super interesting that they're able to, like, non-verbally across the language barrier, across cultures, even remote cultures, recognize basic, like these basic human emotions, almost core essence emotions.
And that's a strong hint that we're looking at something genetic. There's some evolutionary history here. This isn't due to the particulars of some culture. You weren't like socialized to smile when you're happy. So we see it around the world. So it's not just due to some quirk of Western culture or something like that. We have to start talking about evolutionary psychology.
Correct.
You mentioned disgust. Let's talk about disgust. Why disgust? Why do we feel it?
I think disgust is one of those that is indicative of things that could be poisonous. Like if you eat something that generally doesn't taste good, it could be because it could kill you, or it could have harmful effects on your overall body and health.
I think that's a lot of the explanation. Around the world, people are disgusted by the same stuff. People are disgusted by vomit and urine, feces, rotting food. And what all these have in common is they are rich with pathogens. They have germs. And if these germs get inside your body, they can make you sick and kill you. So we have this emotion of disgust. It motivates us to stay away from the types of stuff that has lots of germs.
Right, because those are less than ideal.
So here we have a functional explanation for disgust. There's a reason why we have the emotion. There's a reason why we see it around the world. Interestingly, additional evidence that goes along with this evolutionary theory: people who are easily disgusted have fewer infections.
Ooh. Interesting. Probably because they don't eat all the gross stuff.
Yeah. There are some people who I know of a guy who came across a dead snake and just took a bite into it.
Mm.
And he did live to tell the tale. But some people are easily disgusted, and you know what? They're not going to bite the snake.
At least cook it. I think people eat snakes, or they're
Sure.
meat, so you probably could, but
Sure.
maybe
But
cook it.
if you find a dead snake, definitely do not just chomp into it. That's actually very dangerous.
It's your daily PSA here.
And it's probably not a coincidence that if somebody is intensely disgusted, it can make them throw up. And that's expelling any pathogens that might have gotten inside of your body.
That's an interesting point.
That hasn't happened to me. I do know someone who was cleaning up vomit, and then she got so disgusted she started vomiting herself.
Oh yeah.
So then
I
she
think
had to
that's kind of common.
and then she had to clean up her own vomit. So it was this,
Oh, like a double whammy.
yeah, this pukey feedback loop. And other primates have similar disgust adaptations. Other primates, they don't want to eat food that has touched poo.
Yeah.
Same
makes
thing.
Sense.
Same thing. Let's talk about pregnant women. Most pregnant women will experience pregnancy sickness. They'll get nauseous. Maybe they'll throw up. Maybe they'll have food aversions. I ask, ¿por qué? Why? Why pregnancy sickness?
Things affect you differently when they're pregnant, don't they? Like you're not supposed to eat raw fish, probably because of the pathogens that it can carry. I think it's interesting though that disgust level changes with that. Is it the hormones or is it the pregnancy belly telling you?
Maybe hormones have something to do with it, and that could be part of the proximate explanation. But you also hinted at an ultimate explanation that it has to do with avoiding pathogens, specifically the sorts of pathogens or whatever other substances could affect a developing embryo.
Right, because things affect you very differently when you have another life growing in you.
Even substances that wouldn't be dangerous for you to ingest, they could be dangerous for a developing embryo.
Right.
And these are called teratogens. These are toxins that are harmful to developing embryos.
That's a fun word.
Yeah, teratogen. Lots of foods are toxic to some extent. Apple seeds are toxic.
If you eat a whole bunch of them.
You would have to eat so many, you're never going to eat that many. And likewise, peanut butter is toxic, although you'd have to eat like so much for it to affect you. Black pepper is slightly toxic. So there's a lot of foods that we eat that are very slightly toxic. Our body can handle it. It's no issue, but it could harm a developing embryo.
Are spicy foods one of those foods that are slightly toxic?
We're going to talk about spicy food. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But evidence for this evolutionary theory, the very foods that pregnant women find repugnant are exactly those foods that have the highest doses of toxins, which generally are meats.
Yeah. And cooking meats, I always hear pregnant women have a difficult time with the smell of cooking meat.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Pregnancy sickness occurs precisely at the time when the fetus is most vulnerable to toxins, which is 2 to 4 weeks after conception. And pregnancy sickness tends to disappear by the 14th week, which is the end of the sensitive period for organ development within the embryo.
Interesting.
And one more fun fact. Women who do not get pregnancy sickness in the first trimester are 3 times as likely to miscarry.
Oh, wow. The teratogens.
You put all this together, seems like we have strong evidence that this pregnancy sickness, it's probably not random. It's not just like a side effect of something else going on. It's probably functional in its own right.
Right. I never thought of it as something that could be functional in my head. It was always your body's reaction to an increase in hormones. And I'm sure
Hmm.
that plays into it, but it's just very interesting to think of it as this is a functional mechanism.
Yeah, that theory is plausible that it's just a byproduct, that there's all these changes that go on, and then as a byproduct, a pregnant woman feels sick sometimes. But given all of this evidence, it seems like we should be convinced this is an adaptation. It's not just a byproduct.
Cool. I mean, kind of cool.
All right, let's talk spicy food. Food with hot peppers contains capsaicin. It stimulates thermoreceptors on the tongue. Those are the receptors that sense heat. That's why we associate spicy food with heat. So it can cause this hot sensation. It can also cause pain. But even though it burns, people eat it.
It's delicious. It's good for
People,
your immune
yeah,
system.
people want the burn.
People even have like there's capsaicin cream that you can
Sure.
get.
Yeah.
It's spicy on the skin.
And in that case, it's used to treat pain, right?
Yeah, I've used it for pain before.
Okay. What I want to get at is why do people desire spicy food, at least some people? So we have a straightforward adaptationist explanation for things like why do we like sugar? Why do we like protein? Why do we like fat? Well, these are essential things your body needs to survive. Now, hot peppers don't have some essential nutrient that you couldn't possibly get anywhere else. So why would we want to eat this thing that burns us and it's not like giving us some nutrient we couldn't get from something else?
Is it like a similar idea as using spices? Like spices don't necessarily have nutritional additive to them, but they wars are forged over spices.
Sure, but why would we evolve to like the burn? Why do I want to be burnt when I'm eating?
I don't know.
All right, team, can I give you a hint?
Give me a hint.
Pretty much the same explanation that we've been given this whole time for other things.
It's evolutionarily advantageous.
Because spices can kill pathogens and they can inhibit the growth of pathogens.
Oh,
So if you have this taste for spices, you're going to be drawn to the kind of food that's highly spiced, and that food's going to be less likely to make you sick.
interesting. I think about other cultures who use a lot more spices than Western cultures. I think Western food is notoriously very bland, but like foods from Asia and India that use different and very fragrant, very potent spices that are really delicious. Like it makes me just contemplate the culture and the food as a whole.
Want to know something bonkers?
Yes.
If we think about what predicts food spoilage around the world, what's a factor that would lead food to spoil more quickly? The main factor is going to be the temperature. If it's really, really cold, your food isn't going to spoil. If it's hot, it spoils more quickly. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if we look at recipes from around the world that have just, evolved in these different cultures, what you find is in warmer climates where there's more risk of consuming pathogens in your food, those cultures use more spices.
Oh,
So places like
cool.
Mexico, Thailand, South India, they use lots of spices. Scandinavia is a frozen hellscape. They don't use a lot of spices. Their
They
food is
didn't need
bland.
to.
Yeah, you just get like fish with nothing on it.
Ooh.
I don't really know. I know they eat a lot of fish, but I guess they don't spice it very much.
Interesting. Yeah. Like I was thinking about Mexico too. It's very notorious for having super spicy food,
Mm-hmm.
which in my opinion is a lot less spicy than New Mexican food, but um because we have green chili here, so it's a lot. But like thinking about there's something that I've seen on the internet that's I think it's chamoy.
Mm-hmm.
Sounded really good, and that's a Mexican food. and it's super spicy. Apparently, it's like a spicy candy.
Yeah, I think you can put it on fruit, and it's probably used in tons of ways, but I've had it
I've
on
seen it in
mango.
pickles. Ooh,
Okay.
and mango.
Yeah, it's
That
good on
sounds good.
mango.
Like tahine on watermelon.
I could believe it.
Delicious.
And perhaps it's no coincidence that spice use is more commonly used on meat than vegetable dishes.
That
And
would
meat
make
is more
sense.
likely to have pathogens that can make you sick,
Especially if you don't cook it right.
especially if you don't cook it right. All right, let's take a hard left turn. Why do humans have a sex drive?
That was the hardest U turn, I think.
Well, hear me
Um,
out, hear me out, hear me out.
love
Rocks,
you, do.
rocks don't have a sex drive. Water doesn't have a sex drive. So why us? Why humans?
We're animate, first of all. We're not
Sure.
inanimate. Um,
Yeah, yeah. But there's living things that don't have sex.
this is true. Um, well, we have to have a motivating factor behind reproduction. That's probably the primary example.
Right. It all comes down to reproduction. Evolution's all about reproduction. It's going to select
Always.
for features that facilitate reproduction. We can't reproduce asexually. We reproduce sexually, and sex is the essential behavior which, in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, led to offspring. So we have been selected by evolution to experience sexual attraction and be motivated to have sex.
And it's all influenced by further little aspects of an individual and their immune system and their smell and their appearance and their everything and their
Oh yeah.
signaling.
Yeah, we're going to get into all of that. I just want to emphasize the point that it's not like a random quirk that people have sexual attraction or that, people like sex. It's because our ancestors who really like sex probably did it more and then had more offspring. So all else equal, if you have more sex, that's associated with more reproduction. So this is like the most straightforward application of evolutionary biology. Like obviously this must be the reason why we have a sex drive.
Right.
95% of people experience heterosexual attraction. We go around the world, we mostly see people engaging in heterosexual behavior. We see a similar pattern throughout history. We look at animals, most sexual behavior in animals is heterosexual. So we see this really strong trend. And what could be causing this trend?
I do have a question
Yes.
for your question. I wanted to bring up homosexual attraction too, because that doesn't necessarily lead to reproduction. But you can still have pair bonds across species experiencing homosexual attraction as well.
Mm-hmm.
Poor K.
We're going to get to that.
Oh.
We're going to get to that in 1 minute. But first, I want to understand the strong trend, and then we can try to understand deviations.
Okay, got it.
So why strong trend?
Why do we
Why?
experience?
Yeah, why is that very common? It's very common for people to be attracted to the opposite sex as opposed to any other sort of attraction.
Well, only the opposite sex can help you make a baby.
I think that's right. Heterosexuality is pretty obviously an adaptation. It's not purely due to culture, whatever that could mean. I'm not even sure what that would mean. It's not just random, like when you're born, a die is rolled, and there's some chance you're going to be attracted to trees, and some chance you're going to be attracted to rocks, and maybe the opposite sex. Who knows? There's a very straightforward evolutionary explanation for why the strong trend is people tend to be attracted to members of the opposite sex.
Yes.
And when we say this, I think it might be wise to revisit the basics of evolutionary psychology, we're using this term adaptive in a technical sense. We're saying something about evolutionary biology, not making any kind of ethical claim. We're not talking about good or bad. And we're certainly not making any kind of political argument here. And we're going to talk about homosexuality in a moment. So obviously there's individual differences in sexual orientation. But what we're doing here is we're just explaining the strong trend that we observe.
Right.
All right.
And with adaptive being just increasing your chances of survival a little bit.
Yeah, increasing reproduction throughout our evolutionary history.
Right.
Which doesn't necessarily have any kind of ethical connotation. Like if I think about what's good and bad, I don't necessarily care about whatever happened to maximize reproduction in the African savanna 200,000 years ago.
Right.
All right, so that's heterosexuality. Let's move on to your question. Do you have any thoughts about homosexuality?
I do. My thought is regarding raising and like the community that surrounds. I'm thinking about like bonobos, like raising young together and creating a community, and survival will go up because of the community. When you have others to help you raise your young, when you have others to get food for you while you raise the young, I think that pair bond is really imperative to these like tribes of bonobos. That's just the example that's in my brain right now because I know that we are related to them a little bit. But yeah, that's my thought. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting theory that it has something to do with bonding.
Yeah, and helping helping behaviors that increase survival of the group as a whole.
Mm-hmm. There is a theory that's kind of similar to what you're saying. It's known as the kin altruism theory of homosexuality. And before we dive into it, we should remind ourselves that there's behavioral genetics research looking into homosexuality, and something like 30% of the variance in homosexuality is due to genes. So there's no simple story we can tell where it's like there is a gene and that gene is the sole determinant of homosexuality. It's nothing like that. Most of the variance is not due to genes. It's mostly non-shared environment, but there's a genetic component. And this is kind of the standard story for most things that we examine in psychology. We find that there's this genetic component, but then there's also this large environmental component.
Right.
All right, so going back to this theory. According to this theory, genes associated with homosexuality might increase investment in genetic relatives. Your relatives have copies of the same genes as you. So if you help your relatives, you are helping to propagate your genes into the future. Even if it doesn't mean you are reproducing, you are enhancing the chance of your genes being present in the population in the future by virtue of helping your relatives who have copies of these same genes.
Interesting. That makes sense.
The evidence for this theory is pretty mixed. I wouldn't say that there's strong evidence. An important consideration here is if somebody is exclusively homosexual, like say a man who is only attracted to men, the first order effect is that very clearly decreases reproduction, right?
Right.
Very clearly. So any fitness benefit associated with those genes that are part of the causal story in explaining homosexuality, that benefit would have to be so large as to outweigh this disadvantage of you're not going to be reproducing yourself.
Right. But you're aiding your relatives.
Yeah.
In this theory.
So
man.
You'd have to be aiding your relatives a whole lot for this theory to check out.
Right. And is it in any way related to like decreasing competition in sexual reproduction? Like there are fewer, I'm trying to think of a way to say this. There are fewer individuals present in the population to reproduce, and so there's different competition?
The short answer is no. It's mostly useful to think about evolution at the level of the individual, that
Yeah.
individuals are optimized for reproduction, getting their genes into the next generation. So you might think that there's some benefit to others if I'm not involved in competing for the mates that others want. So maybe I'm like helping them by not participating in that competition.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at.
Okay.
I just couldn't word it coherently.
Unless that is giving you some fitness benefit,
Yeah.
which it's not clear why that would be the case. And also, when you remove yourself from the mating market, that's removing a possible mate that somebody else could have reproduced with.
That's true, yeah.
So it's not like obviously a net benefit, even in the way that you're thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, makes sense.
Another theory, the female fertility hypothesis. According to this theory, genes for male homosexual orientation, they decrease reproduction in males, but if they are found within females, then they increase reproduction.
How so?
This is just one plausible way that those genes could be maintained in the population, is if they decrease reproduction in males, but increase reproduction in females so much that it outweighs the decrease in males.
Okay.
These are some adaptationist theories. Another possibility, which is plausibly the most likely, is that homosexuality was just not selected for. There might not be an adaptationist explanation for it. Pure homosexual orientation is pretty rare. It very clearly reduces reproduction. Most of the variance isn't due to genes. So it's possible that it just wasn't selected for.
Interesting. It's just kind of there.
It's just kind of there.
And we love that.
And at the risk of beating a dead horse, I'm going to again bring up the naturalistic fallacy. It's the idea that if something is natural, it's good. Corollary being if something's not natural, it's bad. So if I'm saying something like, perhaps homosexuality in humans was not selected for, someone might hear me as saying that, well, homosexuality is not natural and therefore bad. And that's not the claim I'm making. Again, we're just making a technical claim about evolutionary biology, not a moral argument, not a political argument.
Correct.
Okay, I believe the horse is dead. We can move on. Let's talk about mate preferences. Do animals choose who to mate with at random?
No.
Do they just mate with the first member of the species that happens to come along?
No.
Why not?
You have to analyze for the possibility that they will produce young that will survive and reproduce themselves.
Right. Animals are looking for particular features. So animals have particular mate preferences, and these mate preferences are adaptations. They increase reproduction as well as facilitating survival and reproduction of offspring.
Yes. I took a class in my undergraduate who was taught by Dr. Jeffrey Miller, who wrote the book What Women Want, which details a lot of these preferences in people and why. And it was amazing. It's a great book, and he has a lot of super pertinent information on it. So I highly recommend it.
Well, how about we get into it? Let's talk about these mate preferences. First, let's talk about the mate preferences of women, and specifically preferences for long-term mates, what a woman is looking for in, say, a long-term partner.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you what women want, Atana, okay?
Okay, you tell me.
Women prefer men with economic resources. This is something we see across animal species. Females commonly prefer males offering resources. One example.
Yes.
One example is the gray shrike. This is a bird. They will impale prey on thorns or other spiky stuff. And right before breeding season, the males will go around trying to amass as many prey as they can in their territory. And then the females go around, they scan all the territories, and they'll mate with the males who have the largest collection of prey.
It's giving like those cities that used to put their enemies' heads on pikes on their walls.
Yes. They're dangerous little birds.
Kind of psychopathic.
In one study, a researcher randomly removed food collected from the territory of some of these male shrikes and added that food to the territory of other male shrikes. And then as a result, the females wanted to mate with the males who had the food added to their territory.
That's so rude of them.
I know. These shrikes, they work so hard to impale live animals on spikes.
That's borderline communism.
Let's turn to humans. David Buss, David Schmidt, you know these guys.
Yeah.
They're psychologists. They're big names in evolutionary psychology. They conducted a study of mate preferences around the world. They recruited participants from 37 different cultures around 6 continents. People had to rate how important different qualities were in a mate. One question they asked participants was, how important is good financial prospects in a mate? In other words, how important is it that your mate is wealthy? And in every single country, women care more than men about the wealth of their partner.
That's really interesting. It has to deal with the men being seen as providers and providing those financial resources to the women.
That's probably part of it.
Little socialization aspect that's plays in, I guess.
And the ability to have amassed that wealth in the first place is also saying good things about you. Like you're the kind of person who can do that.
You're intelligent enough and you're sociable enough, and
yeah, you probably have something. You have something going for you.
Yeah. Not every rich person may, but
sure. On average.
On average.
There was a study of folk tales from 48 different cultures. They found female characters express more interest in the wealth of mates than male characters. And there's a similar study of European literature, found the same thing.
That's interesting because
there's a pattern. It goes way back. Yeah.
Folklore just portrays the culture. So
this is not unique to the West. It's not unique to modern times. This is a trend we have seen throughout history.
Everybody wants a rich man.
Everybody wants a rich man.
Even who's the girl that made the song about being a rich girl? Na 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 na.
I don't know.
I think it might have been Gwen Stefani.
Okay. I know Hollaback Girl.
It's the same girl.
Yeah, okay. I'm just saying I know that song. And I know that she ain't one.
She ain't one.
Yeah, she ain't no Hollaback Girl.
That taught me how to spell banana.
Okay. It's like, when does it end? Banana? Bananana?
Banana-na-na-na.
So men who throughout human evolution were willing to invest in their partner, enhance the health and survival of their partner. Men who were willing to invest in children, enhance the survival of those children. So women were selected to have a preference for mates with access to resources.
Yes.
All right. I'll tell you more about what women want. Okay, Atana?
Always.
Women show a preference for men with high social status.
It feels like it goes hand in hand with being
It goes
wealthy.
hand in hand. It's associated with resources, greater political power, and high status men tend to have other desirable characteristics, like maybe they're talented or athletic or something.
Hopefully something.
Yeah. Something about them made them high status.
Nepotism sometimes.
Sometimes. In that study of 37 cultures, the researchers also asked participants, how important is social status in a mate? And in the vast majority of cultures, women care more about social status than men. And there aren't cultures where men care more than women. There's just some where the difference isn't significant.
That's interesting.
An analysis of 186 societies found that higher status men were wealthier. They had more wives. They provided better nourishment for their children.
Multiple. They had plural wives.
They had more wives, yeah.
Good to know.
Women show a preference for somewhat older men. In this 37 culture study, the researchers asked, what is your preferred age difference between you and your partner? The researchers found that women prefer older mates in every single culture, on average.
Why?
Well, older men tend to have greater access to resources. They tend to have greater social status.
This is true. It makes sense.
But there are some downsides to being with an older man. Older men are more likely to be infertile. As men get older, the sperm that they produce tends to contain a higher rate of genetic mutation. Older men die sooner. If the man is much older, he might be less compatible with a younger woman. So we don't see women going after the oldest possible man, but rather a man who is a bit older than herself.
Is there like an average bit that is older?
Couple of years, it varies by culture.
Okay. So not like, 30s dating 60s.
In no culture is that the average preference.
Okay.
Although, of course, there's individual variation.
Always there is.
Women show a preference for creativity. Women like men who are funny, artistic, musically talented.
This is perplexing because
It's perplexing. Yeah.
Those don't have advantages in the same way that the others do.
Writing songs doesn't help you survive and reproduce.
Unless it puts you at a higher status and gets you more resources.
But in general, it seems like a useless activity.
Yeah. Sorry, singer-songwriters.
Isn't art just this big waste of time and effort? How could this preference evolve?
No, because art is a form of storytelling, and the ways that they used to use it in like cavemen and stuff. There's always been art, and utilizing it to convey messages and morals and history and everything.
That's true, but why would women find it attractive?
The only thing that's coming to my mind, and this probably isn't correct, is because creativity is an asset in leadership. So dating a high status male who's like the leader of something and has the resources is associated with like being creative, finding creative solutions and problem solving and social skills.
I think that's a good theory. I'm going to talk about a theory that is related to what you said, and this is Jeffrey Miller's theory. We want to understand why creativity is sexually attractive. We have to talk about sexual selection. Traits can evolve even if they don't enhance survival. In fact, traits can evolve even if they make survival more difficult, if those traits are preferred by mates. And we've talked about this already when we discussed the peacock's tail. Growing that tail makes survival more difficult. The peacock had to spend resources growing the tail. It's got to dedicate energy to maintaining it, even though the tail itself is not useful. So we can't explain the peacock's tail by invoking some survival function. Rather, the function is related to mating. Specifically, peahens want to mate with the peacocks who are high in genetic quality. They're looking for mates who don't have lots of harmful genetic mutations. And this is because if a peahen mates with a peacock who has lots of harmful mutations, her offspring will have lots of harmful mutations and therefore be less likely to survive and reproduce. So peahens would really like to select the peacocks who have few genetic mutations.
Right. So, like, the tail is signaling that I didn't have to spend all of my energy and resources fighting off sickness and disease and illness and injury. Instead, I got to grow this big, beautiful tail.
That's exactly right. I'll run through the logic a little bit. Peacocks want to be able to signal that they are high in genetic quality. Right? That's information they
Yes.
want to communicate. But guess what? Talk is cheap, right? There's this issue of honest signaling. Every peacock wants to claim that they are a genetically fit peacock, but then why would the peahen ever believe them? So how could a signal evolve that honestly communicated the genetic quality of a peacock in the way that a peahen can trust? And this is where costly signaling comes in. A signal can be honest if it is costly to produce. Only a peacock with the given trait would be able to pay the cost associated with signaling that trait. In this case, the peacock's tail is a costly signal. It is only the peacocks with a relatively high genetic quality who can grow the big, beautiful tail and afford to lug it around, even though it's detrimental to survival. So the very fact that the tail is costly is what makes it a believable signal of genetic quality.
It's foolproof, mostly.
All right, so back to humans. One reason we have art and humor and music is because they are products of sexual selection. They evolved as costly signals of genetic quality. If you're the kind of person who can write a beautiful song, it's a signal you have a certain kind of brain. You're able to do something most people can't do. And a lot of that comes down to genetic quality or having fewer harmful mutations. So art and humor and music, they are our human equivalent of a peacock's tail. They're a way of showing off things about yourself to potential mates.
Oh, interesting. In my brain, costly signaling was always like clothes and cars and expensive things and all of those flashy, which are still costly signals, but I didn't consider creativity in that.
What you're talking about is analogous. It's conspicuous consumption.
Oh, okay.
And it's the exact same logic that if
Yeah.
you have a Ferrari, that's an honest signal of your wealth because only a very rich person would waste that much money on a Ferrari.
They're not even that cool.
They're not even that cool. So you're buying something that is useless in the sense that if you want to get from point A to point B, you don't have to spend $100,000. But the function is I'm showing how much money I could set on fire. It's an honest signal that I must have a lot of money.
Right. Like the Louboutin purses for girls.
Sure, yeah. Louboutin.
Like Louis Vuitton. They're like
Louis Vuitton. Yeah, I know the
$2,500.
brand. I know the
No,
brand.
Louboutin's a different one, and people get mad if you mix them up. So I
All
learned
right.
that.
I did not even know. I've heard of Louis. It's Louis Vuitton.
Yeah, Louis
Okay.
Vuitton. Louboutin is the red bottom heels.
Okay. Yeah, this is beyond my ken.
This is something I'm learning this year.
Okay.
Okay, we're all new to this.
This theory of art, it's not meant to explain all of human art. Art probably serves other functions as well, but it's just one theory to help us understand why art evolved in the first place.
I'm still just thinking back to like the caveman paintings and how they used fire. This is just off topic, but how they used fire to like animate things and make things move. The first art, the first movies.
Mm-hmm. They made little animals with their hands, gave them voices, probably.
I like to think so.
So there's tons and tons of research on mate preferences. We have just scratched the surface here. But to step back and make a broader point, it should be clear that who women are attracted to is not mostly due to culture, whatever that could mean. It's not like a woman watches a movie and then that like brainwashes her into finding, wealthy, high status men attractive, which is not to say that culture has no effect on mate preferences. Clearly it does. But we shouldn't think that, culture just kind of appears out of nowhere. It's unexplained, and then we are blank slates. So the culture just kind of shapes us as if we are clay and like
Right.
determines our preferences.
There's more to it.
There's more to it.
Well, even like the smallest things determine your preference, and you may not even know. Like, there was a study done about t-shirts. They had men sweat in a bunch of t-shirts and then had the women smell them and rate they're attracted to. And I think the conclusion was your pheromones and your body odor is related to your immune system. And so mating with an individual who has a complementary but not identical immune system as you will give your offspring the best outcomes.
Yeah, I think the more symmetrical men smelled more attractive.
Oh, interesting. I couldn't remember who smelled better, but I knew it was,
And the idea
yeah.
is that the more symmetrical men are higher in genetic quality.
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure how well that research has held up. I'd have to look into it again. It's definitely very interesting research.
Yeah, it was just a good thing to think about. Food for thought.
All right, let's talk lesbians. There are similarities and differences between the mate preferences of heterosexual women and lesbians. Similar to heterosexual women, lesbians value kindness, dependability, emotional stability. Lesbians differ in their tolerance for age differences. Lesbians tend to be more tolerant of larger age gaps, both older and younger. And lesbians also differ in their height preferences. So, whereas women tend to prefer men who are at least somewhat taller than themselves, lesbians tend to prefer mates who are roughly the same height.
Interesting. I wonder why that is.
In the case of understanding heterosexual women's preferences, height could be an indicator that the guy is better at protecting you and your children.
Yeah. Big, strong,
Mm-hmm.
protecting male. But that's not the case with lesbians.
Homosexuality might not have an adaptive logic behind it,
Ah,
as we discussed before. So,
yes.
if that's the case, then we might not be able to apply this adaptationist framework to understand the mate preferences of gay people.
Okay. That makes sense.
All right, let's move on. Talk about the mate preferences of men when men are looking for a long term mate. Attracting and maintaining a long term mate is expensive for men in terms of time and energy. So, from an evolutionary perspective, we would predict that men are going to prefer a mate who have a long reproductive career ahead of them, which is to say, men will prefer women who could have a greater number of children. And by this measure, we would predict that men would prefer, say, a 20-year-old woman compared to a 40-year-old woman because a 20-year-old woman is going to be able to have more children.
Right. And potentially healthier children, because I know you mentioned this with males too, but as females age, there is more mutations in their gametes, potentially.
Right. Another feature, which you're kind of hinting at here, that we would predict that men will be selected to prefer is fertility. This is the probability of conceiving and producing viable offspring. So if a woman has sex, what's the chance she becomes pregnant and delivers a healthy baby? And both of these features, fertility and having a long reproductive career, these are both in decline in women, certainly by their mid 20s. Women in their early 20s are relatively high in fertility. They have a high reproductive capacity. And as you mentioned, advanced maternal age, especially above 35, that's also correlated with negative health outcomes in offspring like Down syndrome.
I'm also curious how male attraction changes as females age. So, like for instance, an older single man and an older single woman who's past her reproductive years or has hit menopause. I'm just curious of any changes that has.
Let's talk about it. In that study of 37 cultures, the researchers wanted to test this idea that men should prefer mates who are relatively young based on this evolutionary logic. So these researchers asked men in these 37 cultures, what's your preferred age difference between you and your partner? And in every society studied, men prefer young wives. And as men get older, they prefer mates who are increasingly younger. So men in their 30s prefer women who are about 5 years younger. Men in their 50s prefer women who are 10 to 20 years younger. Okay. So I guess they're still older in an absolute sense, but there's a bigger relative difference.
That's interesting. It's almost like they're staying within the reproductive age as their preference.
Mm-hmm. Now, evolutionary theory does not predict that men should always want a woman who's younger. This evolutionary theory predicts that men are looking at cues of fertility. And this leads to a very specific prediction. Teenage boys should prefer a mate who are slightly older than themselves because women in their late teens, early 20s are more fertile than women who are younger than that.
Yes.
And indeed, there was a study of boys, 12 to 19. They were asked, what's the ideal age of a dating partner for you? And teenage males do prefer mates who are a few years older than themselves, even though those women would probably have no interest in them. But, if you ask them, that's what they say they want.
Some cases that may have some legal repercussions.
Sure. Let's talk about beauty. Infants gaze longer at things that they like, or at least it seems that way. We can't get inside their head, but it seems like they look at stuff that they like.
Has anyone tried asking? Just ask them.
You know what? People have tried. These infants won't say a damn word.
That's rude.
There was a study in which adults rated the attractiveness of faces. These faces were then shown to infants, and these are 2 to 3 month olds. And these infants gaze longer at the faces that the adults rated as attractive.
And in general, we see attractiveness. A lot of times it's related to symmetry, how symmetrical their faces are.
Sure. There's a bunch of cross-cultural studies in which people are shown pictures of women's faces, they rate the attractiveness. And then researchers see, is there a correlation across cultures? Do people of one culture tend to agree with the judgments of beauty in other cultures? And the answer is a resounding yes. When you calculate a correlation, the strongest positive correlation you can get is +1. And when we look at judgments of beauty across cultures, we're getting correlations of around 0.9.
Wow.
Yeah. In social science, you basically never see that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you never see correlations that high. But people mostly agree on who's beautiful.
It's like 90% correlation.
Of course, there's variation across individuals and there's variation across cultures, but there's a whole lot of agreement.
So you're beautiful in China too.
You're beautiful in China too. We expect people to have mate preferences. We expect these preferences to be adaptive. So, for example, we might expect men to be attracted to features associated with youth and health.
Right.
And indeed, the features that cause men to characterize women as beautiful are often associated with youth and health. Let's go through them. The presence of sores, facial disfigurement, lesions, and ringworm are universally considered unattractive.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Younger women have longer and higher quality hair, and hair quality correlates with self-reported health. Clear skin, which is associated with youth and health, is universally considered attractive. Having a white sclera, so that's the white part of your eye, having it be white as opposed to like more red or yellow, that's associated with health, and it's also judged as more attractive.
And like your dental health, I'm sure that plays into it too.
I'm sure it does. When it comes to the face, A feature that men are typically attracted to is referred to as facial femininity. And this includes full lips, large eyes, thin jaw, small chin, high cheekbones, short distance between the mouth and jaw. And as women age, their facial features become less feminine. This facial femininity correlates with estrogen levels, which predicts fertility, and it also correlates with health.
Right. That makes sense. All of these pretty strong indicative factors.
There was a study of 26 cultures around the world in which participants were presented with a lineup of female bodies that vary in weight. Do you know about this study?
I don't think so.
Okay. The lineup featured 9 bodies. Body number 1 had very little fat. Body number 2 had a little bit more fat. Number 3 had a little bit more, all the way up to body number 9, which had a very high level of fat. Male participants were asked to select which body they found the most attractive. The researchers calculated the average for men in 10 world regions: Southeast Asia, East Asia, South and West Asia, Oceania, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Africa, North America, South America. Consistently, the male average for a particular world region is somewhere between bodies 3 and 4. And I think these bodies could be described as a little bit on the thin side. There is some variation across world regions, although honestly not that much. You find the lowest average for men in East Asia. So these men are preferring the skinniest women. Their average was 3.2. You find the highest average in Scandinavia, where it's 4.1. So if you take a sample of a lot of men and you just calculate the average, you find that there's a lot of agreement regarding body weight preferences. And from an evolutionary perspective, this does make sense that men prefer women with a sort of middling level of body fat, because very low levels of fat and very high levels of fat are both associated with low fertility.
That's interesting that in Scandinavia there's a bit higher because it's a lot colder there. So the body fat's probably advantageous to, living, not freezing to death.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I don't know what the explanation is. I think your explanation is interesting. I don't know if there's a correlation between body weight preference and temperature. There might be.
I think that would be cool to look into more.
Of course, there's individual variation. We just talked about how there's cultural variation, but really there's a lot of agreement across cultures. It's not like there's a region of the world where all the men prefer super low levels of fat, and then some other region where all the men prefer a super high level of fat.
Yeah, but it's about the same across.
On average.
Good to know.
Who do you think cares more about the physical appearance of their mates, men or women?
Men.
You're correct. In that 37 culture study, people were asked, how important is physical attractiveness in a long-term mate? In every single culture, men care more about looks than women.
Yeah.
All right, at this point, I think it's clear what people are attracted to. It's mostly not due to the particulars of culture, and it's certainly not some evil conspiracy. There's no evil people of secret meetings, and they decide to brainwash people into being attracted to particular features. So women who are cast in leading roles for movies are often relatively young and beautiful. This isn't an evil conspiracy. Studios cast young, beautiful women because the point of movies is to make money. You make money if people see your movie, and people like watching movies where they can look at beautiful actors on the screen. So there's nothing nefarious going on. If you want to make money producing media, you have to give people what they want, and people want beauty.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's big aesthetics. They're having meetings behind closed doors. And
now let's talk about the mate preferences of gay men. Similar to heterosexual men, gay men put a lot of emphasis on appearance, and they don't care so much about wealth. So heterosexual men generally don't care so much about the wealth of potential female mates, and you see the same thing in gay men. And gay men tend to prefer more masculine faces.
that makes sense if you're gay.
All right, let's talk about short-term mating. This is short-term sexual encounters, things like one-night stands. And there's a theory from biology that could help us understand short-term mating in humans. Parental investment theory. In a given species, the sex that invests more in reproduction is choosier. And this is a regularity you find in animals. Reproduction is typically more costly for females. In many species, the only contribution of the male is sex cells, whereas females are paying the energy costs associated with pregnancy. As a result, females tend to be choosier. They're picky. They're more selective regarding who they want to have sex with.
As they should be.
As they should be. Do you know about the seahorses?
The seahorses who the males give birth?
Yeah, the males carry around and nourish the developing embryo. So the males pay a higher cost associated with reproduction.
It's flipped.
And as predicted by this theory, the males are choosier.
Yeah. They don't want a female who's going to run out on them.
They don't want no scrub.
They don't want no scrub.
In humans, women have the greater obligatory parental investment. In order to have offspring, women bear the costs of pregnancy and lactation. For men, the minimal cost is very low. To have offspring, all men have to do at minimum is have sex. So for women, costs of reproduction are quite high, whereas for men, costs of reproduction are quite low. The benefit of having offspring is the same for men and women, but from an evolutionary perspective, you generally expect an organism to do something when the expected fitness benefit outweighs the expected fitness cost. The benefit is the same for men and women, but the expected cost for women is much higher. So we would predict, based on parental investment theory, that humans will follow the same pattern as most animals, and the females will be choosier than the males.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Is that consistent with your impressions of men and women? Women tend to be choosier?
No, weirdly, I think that males tend to be choosier, but that's simply my perspective.
What about short-term mating? We're focused on short-term mating. So if it is just a purely sexual encounter, do you think men are pickier or do you think women are pickier?
Women, that's true. I was thinking more long term.
I think that's right. Women tend to be pickier. Let's talk about the data. There was a study in which a female student confederate approached male students on a college campus. She would say, "I've been noticing you around campus. I find you very attractive." And then this was followed by one of 3 invitations. Would you go out with me tonight? Would you come over to my apartment? Or would you go to bed with me? So the study had 3 conditions. The study was repeated using male student confederates who approached female students on the same college campus. And the study followed the same procedure, had the same 3 conditions. The researchers wanted to know what proportion of people approached would accept the invitation. When the female confederates approached male students and asked, "Would you go out with me tonight?" 56% of men said yes. When the female confederate said, "Would you come to my apartment?" 63% said yes. And when she said, "Would you go to bed with me?" 71% of men said yes. So as it became a more sexual invitation, men were more likely to say yes.
Interesting.
On the other hand, when the male confederates approached the female students and asked, "Would you go out with me tonight?" 50% of women said yes, which I think it's interesting that it was this high, although this was done like 30 years ago. When the male confederate asked, "Would you come over to my apartment?" only 7% said yes. And when he said, "Would you go to bed with me?" 0 said yes.
That's a very big difference from the males' 70s.
So we're seeing the opposite pattern in men and women.
Yes. I also think it was interesting how it dropped from "would you go out" was 50, "would you come to my apartment" 7.
Yeah.
7. That's smart. Don't go to people's apartments that you don't know, please.
True. It's true. There was a study of 52 countries. Researchers recruited participants from North America, South America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Middle East, Africa, Oceania, South Asia, East Asia. Participants were asked, ideally, how many different sexual partners would you like to have in the next month? They were also asked how many sex partners they would want over the next year, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And in every single country, across every single time frame, men said they want more sex partners than women.
That's pretty evident too in our culture and the way that quote unquote body count is perceived.
Indeed. And we know it's not just some quirk of the United States or something like that, because we are seeing men preferring more sex partners than women all around the world.
Right.
There was a study in which men and women were asked, how likely would you be to consent to sex with someone you viewed as desirable if you had known that person for 1 hour? They also asked about receptivity to sex across different lengths of time, including 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years. Across every length of time, men express a greater willingness to have sex.
That's interesting.
Men report having about twice as many sexual fantasies. Men's fantasies more often include strangers or multiple partners. When asked, have you imagined sexual encounters with more than 1,000 people? 8% of women say yes, 32% of men say yes.
Wow.
Men are more likely to dream about sex. How many times do you experience sexual desire per week? Women say 9 times, men say 37 times. In a study of 200,000 people from 53 nations in every single country, men report having a higher sex drive than women. Men are more likely to engage in extramarital affairs. In all cultures, men are much more likely than women to solicit a prostitute. So yeah, the data is consistent with parental investment theory.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Well, there are so many more applications of evolutionary theory to help us understand psychology, aren't there?
Always.
And I think we should explore those on the next episode of The Scientific Worldview.